Toni Morrison says, the function of freedom is to free somebody else. When I think of the blessing of choice, it leads me to think not only of our freedom, but also of other rooms in my life, in all of our lives, where decisions are made and ends and beginnings take place. I think of all those rooms we find ourselves in. As a young feminist in my 20s, I was part of a small group who started an abortion fund for people who needed abortions in North Carolina but could not afford them. I remember being on the phone counseling one young girl, age 13, who had been raped by a family member. She would not say who. The room she spoke to me from was her bathroom, where she was hiding with a phone, hiding from her family, who could not know anything about this, or she was sure she would be cast out, taken by the state, or brutally punished. There I was in my room, safe and free. I remember clearly the twinkle lights hanging around the ceiling as I sat on my bed in the room I rented in the house I shared with friends as I went through the list of questions. Did she have some allowance money stashed away? Or anything she could sell to help pay for the procedure? A TV, some jewelry, or some clothes maybe? She had nothing. She was 13, and anyway, she couldn't let her family know she was selling her things because that would lead to questions. We wrote to the Ms. Foundation and received a grant that had to last a year. We got her the money, we found her a ride, and we helped her make a choice that kept her safe, housed, and free to continue with her schooling. All we had was a cell phone, early days of cell phones too, a big cell phone, and the will to ask for money so women and girls across North Carolina could stay safe and free. We planned it all in our own living rooms, just 4 people in our early 20s sitting on beat-up couches we'd bought from Goodwill, who got together to make something happen for other women in our state. See, we felt free enough to free somebody else. I know many of us have been taking in a lot of footage on social media of underground rooms, bomb shelters in Ukraine, where people are hunkered down now, trying to keep safe and sane. Well, there's one video in particular, maybe you've seen it, that is very difficult to watch. A young girl of about 5 years old stands on a chair in a bomb shelter filled with people, her neighbors possibly lying in repose or standing, looking visibly traumatized. She looks out into this community of those who have gathered for shelter, and she begins to sing in Ukrainian, and it's instantly recognizable as Elsa's song from the 2013 film Frozen, Let It Go. And if you think about it, and you listen to her, and you see her face as you sing it, you realize this is a song about autonomy and freedom and breaking out of hiding. With her large eyes and her bright smile, she sings her song of freedom to a room full of the imprisoned. Let it go, let it go, I am one with the wind and sky. Let it go, you'll never see me cry. Here we stand, and here we stay. Let the storm rage on. The cold never bothered us anyway. Why do we still have to sing for our freedom? In 2022, why do we have to tell our stories up here to prove that our lives are worth fighting for? The ethical gymnastics that we must undertake to prove that we are a good-hearted, life-affirming people, even if we have to fight like hell for the one life we have left to fight for, our own. It's the rooms I remember the most. The waiting room, where I sat with countless women, girls, and people at FemCare, an abortion clinic in Asheville, North Carolina, founded by a wonderfully warm and loving doctor who eventually had to shut it down a couple of years ago when the constant bomb threats and death threats became too much for her and her family. But I remember the room. I remember gray waiting rooms with all the wrong magazines on the tables. I wanted it to be old issues of Sassy or new issues of Bust or maybe the zines that I knew some of the Asheville artists were making, but it was the wrong magazines. I remember low, dank ceilings and fluorescent lighting and the glum staff who just seemed to be worn thin by the constant stream of protests and threats every day of their working lives. I sat with women who wanted to talk. I sat with some people who wanted silence. And I remember other rooms, the sterile countertops of the anteroom where I worked at Planned Parenthood for a year, lined with urine samples, where I would take people's temperatures, blood pressure, and then give them the news that they were pregnant or not. I remember the sounds in that room of wailing, tears, and silent resignation that walked out of that room in equal measure. And then I would be alone in the room, just a witness to someone's freedom being wrenched from their life, someone forced to grow up a little faster and make a choice, heavy as the anchor they appeared to drag out of the room and out into their lives. Then there's the room where I spent a day last January 29th speaking to the Georgia Senate, who were in session to pass the budget that day. I was the chaplain of the day, or pastor of the day, as they call it, and I preached to them using the Georgia state motto as my primary source text. Politicians like to think of themselves as worthy of their state motto, which in our case is just 3 simple words. Maybe you know them: wisdom, justice, and moderation. On that pristine, original carpeted floor, I looked out onto the beautifully polished wooden desks and I preached the same words to them that I tell you now. The function of freedom is to free somebody else. They heard me that day. In that moment, they lined up to greet me. I mean, Republicans, Democrats, across the aisle. I stayed for quite some time. You can see it on YouTube or on their website. The moment actually landed more powerfully than I had hoped. But since that moment, they have heard other interests and different preachers who cannot affirm the blessing of choice and bodily freedom. At this time, held up in the courts at the moment is House Bill 481. It's a fetal heartbeat bill, stating that except in certain situations, physicians practicing medicine in the state of Georgia would be prohibited from offering abortion services to pregnant women if a fetal heartbeat is present, which typically occurs in the 6th week of pregnancy. Now, this is precisely the moment when a large majority of people learn they are pregnant. Most of the people I counseled in my years at Planned Parenthood and the North Carolina Abortion Fund, well, they were well past 6 weeks. In all likelihood, this bill will pass this summer or fall when the Supreme Court hears a similar challenge to Roe v. Wade from Mississippi. And if we are to meaningfully show up to the religious, moral, and ethical debate about abortion, well, I believe we must bring a theology that includes not only the pregnant person's life, but also the life that is emerging. A womb is like a room, too, isn't it? So much takes place there, or doesn't. In a room, people enter and they leave. So this is my theology of pre-birth. I believe that life will come. Life will find a way to enter into the family of all souls here on earth. A life that is meant to be will be. And in my life, I have had 4 miscarriages, 1 abortion, and 2 births. Well, technically 1 birth. But I believe my children were always going to come. Maybe they would be born to me, or maybe they would be born to someone else. The preborn is but an emerging soul, not yet emerged. A baby that is not born today will be born to someone else on a different day. Unitarian Universalism affirms all life. We uphold the sanctity of life. We care for the sanctity of a person's life to choose whether they want to carry a baby in their body. A person's body must never be treated as solely a vessel for another body, because that would render them an object, not a body at all. We uphold the sanctity of life in a universalist theology, declaring that a precious and holy life that is meant to be here will be. A theology of life's emergence. This is my theology. It may not work for you, but it does work for me in the context of our universalism. And I think that's a conversation we Unitarian Universalists need to show up to. Furthermore, we affirm the life of a child to have their basic needs met and a loving family who wants to raise them. Over 30,000 abortions were performed in Georgia in 2020. Is Georgia prepared to offer serious and substantial financial support to 30,000 mothers and parents? No such offer has been made. If anything, we have to fight tooth and nail to try to expand Medicaid and SNAP benefits for people who are raising children, to fight for programs that would offer the sanctity of life to a child in our state. The first bill my fellow clergy and I advocated for with the newly formed Georgia Interfaith Public Policy Center in 2019 was House Bill 345, finally banning the practice of shackling inmates while they are in labor. This was not made law until May 2019. Senator Sharon Cooper, a Republican lawmaker, said the bill restored a measure of dignity to pregnant inmates while they gave birth. A measure of dignity. How to measure the dignity of a person. However, these same legislators who claim to uphold the Living Infants Fairness Equality Act, that's what they call the Abortion Ban Act, they do not have a single plan to support living infants' rights to fairness and equality once they are born. The hypocrisy is overwhelming and leads us all into a state of moral decay, where lawmakers legislate to control someone's body while they are pregnant, and then after the birth, abandon them to poverty, homelessness, domestic violence, lack of adequate health care. Now, I powerfully believe abortion is a moral issue. As a Unitarian Universalist, as a person of faith who affirms and upholds the sanctity of life, I will fight for all Georgians and all people who get pregnant to be entitled to the blessing of choice. Without the right to an abortion, I would not be here today in the service of God and Spirit, serving humanity, working to bring about heaven on earth. I too found myself in a room, looking into the mirror and facing the inner knowing with the very core of my being that I could not bring a child into that room. It wasn't that I didn't want a child. In fact, I have always known since I was very young that I wanted to parent children. But at that moment, it wasn't time. I was too young then, too unsettled and unformed to be a good or even a safe parent. It was not too difficult of a choice. It was more of a gut feeling of no, not now. Though I knew deep in my heart and in my soul that this child was not scheduled to arrive at this time, it felt like every person I encountered in this process was committed to excavating some inner ambivalence or trauma or shame from within me. But there was none to be found, not even a fossil of shame. I walked by protesters on the way in, screaming at me, crying women in the waiting room, rude front desk staff who clearly were more ambivalent than I expected them to be. Even the cold nurse who told me legally we needed to have a sonogram and legally I needed to see it. It was my body. It was my life. And as far as I knew, it was the only one I would ever have. And I knew just as powerfully, to my core, that I wanted that body, this body in this lifetime, to bring forth new life. Just not yet. I remember even being on the table, looking up at the bright lights in the ceiling and talking to the nurses about my desire to reinvigorate a long-defunct local chapter of the National Organization of Women, a plan I actually executed in the months that followed. I remember asking the nurses, this is like as it's happening, asking the nurses and the doctors if they would come to the local chapter of NOW if I held it nearby the office. They asked if I wanted to lie back quietly. And I did not. No, I wanted to plan and scheme and use my freedom to free somebody else. Which brings me back to this room here. We can be sanctuary for more than just us. In the probable event that Roe versus Wade is struck down, abortion becomes mostly illegal here in Georgia, we can answer the call of our moment. We can. We can use our freedom to free somebody else. Unitarian Universalist congregations, Christian churches, and synagogues across Texas have organized to help ensure women's safe and free passage to New Mexico for their abortion procedures this past year. We must not allow the neo-fascism presenting itself in our legislatures to abolish our freedom to care for each other, to uphold and affirm all life, nor shall we allow it to extinguish our moral imagination. May this bright and beautiful flame you see before you and the many stories it represents remind us of the fire of commitment we carry inside to ensure that all people have freedom and agency over their reproductive choices, and that reproductive justice is upheld as a fundamental right for this and future generations. Because to live in this world, you must be able to do 3 things. To love what is mortal. Hold it against your bones, knowing your own life depends on it. And when the time comes to let it go, to let it go.